This is aspirin, the most commonly used medicine in the entire world. Except, it almost wasn't. Its parent chemical company, Bayer AG, nearly passed on developing aspirin in favor of its other new drug, one that you've definitely heard of before. So in today's video, you'll learn how aspirin took the medical world by storm at the turn of the 20th century, how international politics upended the aspirin market, and how aspirin's anti-blood clotting effects cemented its status as the drug we all have in our medicine cabinets. At some point, you've probably heard that aspirin came from the willow tree, and this is kind of true, but not totally. It is part of the lineage, but it's not a direct offspring of willow. It's true that everyone from the ancient Assyrians and Egyptians to traditional Chinese, African, and indigenous American healers historically used willow in their treatments. And it's true that they documented how it could reduce fevers and inflammation, with the caveat that fevers and inflammation meant different things back then compared to today. So by the time the field of pharmacology got started, scientists were curious to see if they could use chemistry to find the healing chemical in willow. But the 17th and 18th century scientists were originally more concerned with a different medicinal plant called cinchona, which led to quinine, the first anti-malarial drug. Now, if you've had a gin and tonic before, you know that quinine is quite bitter. So these early drug hunters thought that other bitter plants might have medicinal properties too. Sure enough, in 1758, an English clergyman named Reverend Edmund Stone nibbled on some willow bark and noticed that it tasted bitter too. And since cinchona wasn't native to England, he wondered if willow might work as a cheap, local substitute for the Peruvian bark, another name for cinchona. There wasn't much scientific research on it, so he decided to conduct his own trial. He would grind up some willow bark and mix it in water. Then when he ran into a patient with agues, another way of describing the fever from malaria, he'd give them increasingly bigger doses until their fevers broke. He did this for 5 years and treated 50 patients all in all. So he thought, great, I found a new quinine. But in reality, the plants work quite differently. Quinine attacks the parasite that causes malaria, while the active ingredient in willow just relieves symptoms, like fever. Stone sent his report to the Royal Society in 1763, but he died before gaining much traction. Still, willow was so deeply rooted in pharmacy, pun intended, that chemists kept coming back to it. Like in 1824, 2 Italian pharmacists isolated willow's active ingredient, which is the component of a medicine that exerts a physiologic effect. In this case, the thing that lowers fevers. They called it salicin, based on the Latin translation for willow. A few years later, other scientists came up with methods for getting bigger yields of clean, isolated salicin crystals, which made experimentation more accessible. And by the 1830s, scientists had created salicylic acid. Some started with salicin derived from willow, while others started with salicylaldehyde extracted from meadowsweet, a member of the rose family that produces salicylates. And it seemed like salicylic acid was going to be a much more effective drug than salicin. So in 1859, a chemistry professor named Hermann Kolbe figured out a way to synthesize salicylic acid. No more willow trees required. One of Kolbe's students even started a chemical factory, in part to produce salicylic acid. And soon after, more chemical companies followed his example. As a result, salicylic acid got extremely popular as a pain and fever reliever, because not only was it one of the only drugs on the market that actually worked, now we could mass produce it inexpensively. And throughout the 1870s and 80s, doctors started doing clinical trials on the drug and confirmed that it was especially effective at lowering fevers and relieving pain. Unfortunately, there was one side effect they couldn't ignore. It hurt patients' tummies. And it turned out that someone already had a solution, they just didn't know it yet. In 1853, Charles Gerhardt created a compound called acetylsalicylic acid, which is the active ingredient of aspirin. Unfortunately, Gerhardt's process for making the compound was complicated and time-intensive, so acetylsalicylic acid wasn't a hit right away, until a couple of chemical companies started dabbling in the pharmaceutical industry, one of which was Friedrich Bayer and Company, or just Bayer. In 1888, Bayer told one of their chemists, Carl Duesberg, to start looking for potential medicines to make. Now, mid-19th century chemistry was at the point where you could take existing molecules and tweak them into new chemicals with different properties, which is what Duesberg planned to do with drugs. He'd start with existing, known drug compounds and chemically modify them into new and improved compounds. And to that end, salicylic acid made for a great target. It already had a track record of success as an antipyretic, and it was easy to find. And Duesberg knew that if he could keep the anti-inflammatory properties of salicylic acid, but tweak it into a more tummy-friendly form, then they'd have a banger on their hands. So he hired a chemist named Arthur Eichengrun and a pharmacologist named Heinrich Draeser, and these two didn't quite get along. One day, in August of 1897, Eichengrun told one of his chemists, Felix Hoffmann, to see if he could add acetyl groups to two existing drugs, morphine and salicylic acid. This was salicylic acid from meadowsweet, not from Willow. He succeeded at both of them, creating diacetylmorphine and acetylsalicylic acid. So, he sent both compounds off to the pharmacology team, and both passed animal testing. And that made for a dilemma. With a limited research budget, which new chemical do you pursue? Well, given the history of side effects with salicylic acid, Dracer and the pharmacology team were more interested in diacetylmorphine, but Eichengrun's chemistry team saw more possibilities in acetylsalicylic acid. Like, something that could reduce fever, pain, and inflammation could be used for all kinds of conditions. Both drugs had the potential for commercial success. Ultimately, Duisberg sided with the pharmacology team. Bayer pursued diacetylmorphine and released it as heroin. But Eichengrun decided he'd pursue acetylsalicylic acid anyway. As the saying goes, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. He got in touch with a Bayer rep named Felix Goldman and started organizing a human trial in Berlin. Goldman gave out a bunch of samples to doctors and dentists, who gave it to their patients and reported back to Goldman. Obviously, it was unethical to not get informed consent from these folks, but I promise it wasn't the worst thing that Bayer ever did. Go check out my video about sulfa drugs to hear about some messed up stuff during World War II. Regardless, they got great results right away, like miraculous pain relief from toothaches, it cured fevers, all kinds of results that pointed to a miracle drug. So Eichengrun takes his results and shows them to Dracer, and he's still not impressed. He's quoted as saying, "The product has no value." But after their boss, Duisberg, saw the results, he decided that acetylsalicylic acid was worth pursuing as a commercial product. It went through clinical trials just fine, and by 1899, Dracer, the original hater, published an essay of his results without mentioning anyone else on the team. Now it was time to start marketing the drug. But Bayer would need a catchy, easy-to-remember name. They used A for acetyl, Spear for Spirea ulmaria, the scientific name for the salicin-producing meadowsweet plant, and In to make it a little easier to pronounce. And voila, Aspirin was born. Now, if we were to end the story here, that would already be enough for aspirin to be legendary in the history of medicine. Like, for years, humans had found drugs in nature. We got morphine from opium, digitalis from foxglove, or quinine from cinchona. But now that we had this new chemistry, we transitioned from plants to compounds that we could isolate, synthesize, and study. Aspirin represented an inflection point into modern pharmacology. Now, we'll get to the marketing story in a second, but before we do, there's some controversy around the story I just told you. According to Bayer's website, Hoffmann was experimenting with salicylic acid not because he was told to by Eichengrun, but because his father needed a drug for his rheumatism and was tired of the side effects of regular salicylic acid. None of the scientists involved in creating aspirin published official accounts of the discovery right away, and Bayer didn't release an official history until the 1940s. But at that point, the Nazis were in power, so instead of crediting the Jewish Eichengrun, they assigned credit to Hoffmann. Eichengrun was held at a concentration camp in 1944, and survived to tell his side of the story. So in 1949, he was like, I had a role in this too, which, understandably, he didn't feel safe saying any time before then. But despite providing documentation showing he took the lead, most modern stories don't mention him. But at the same time, the official US patent from 1900 only lists Hoffmann as the discoverer, and you're probably not going to sneak that one through without approval from the supervisors. I'll link to an article down in the doobly-doo called The Discovery of Aspirin, a Reappraisal, if you want a good analysis of the primary sources. Either way, now that Bayer's got aspirin, they need to market it. But they know that to do it right, they need to avoid a mistake they made 10 years earlier. See, a few years before aspirin, Bayer rolled out another pain-relieving fever reducer called phenacetin. They patented it in the US in 1888, and at first sold it for $1 an ounce, the same price they sold it for in Germany. But thanks to German patent law, they couldn't patent it domestically, so competitors started making their own versions, which caused the price to drop. But since they had an American patent and could defend their monopoly, Bayer kept the $1 an ounce price in the United States. As a result, American pharmacists started importing the drug from other countries, like Canada, where the price was only 35 cents an ounce. So Bayer sued the American pharmacists, retailers, and importers on the grounds that Bayer had the exclusive right to sell phenacetin in the US. Here's the thing. Phenacetin is a trademarked brand name. Its generic name was acetophenetidine, but its American patent lists phenacetin as the invention, which implied that was the generic name. Bayer was trying to act like the ethical drug makers for this drug, so they didn't advertise phenacetin to patients, and they didn't defend its trademark that intensely. So in practice, the brand name phenacetin became the de facto generic name. It's kind of like Kleenex and facial tissues. So when it came time to market aspirin, Bayer was determined not to make the same mistake twice. Now, acetylsalicylic acid had already been documented in Germany by Gerhardt, so it wasn't eligible for a German patent. But Bayer could take out patents in Great Britain and the United States, which they did in 1900. And just like with phenacetin, American pharmacists imported aspirin from other countries, and Bayer threatened to sue. They would definitely protect their IP this time around. And this time, before getting patents, Bayer trademarked the name aspirin. They needed people to associate the name aspirin with the brand Bayer, and that was their second part of their aspirin strategy: branding. This meant branding on the bottles, which contained aspirin powder at first, and then branded tablets soon after. And this came alongside a huge marketing push. Allegedly the single biggest campaign for any one drug in history up to that point. My favorite example is this ad. Quote, "Demand Bayer aspirin. Say Bayer aspirin. Accept only Bayer package." I told you, they went hard on branding, and it worked. By early 20th century standards, aspirin was the first blockbuster drug. Technically, a blockbuster is a drug that has earned $1 billion in annual revenue, but given that it came out before billionaires existed, we'll modify our threshold. But the good times couldn't last forever, and Bayer went through some ups and downs for the next few decades. In 1905, a British court ruled that Bayer's patent on aspirin was invalid. The judge said that Hoffman's process wasn't much different than a process invented before him, therefore Bayer lost its patent in Britain along with its market dominance. A similar lawsuit was brought up in the US, but the court ruled in favor of Bayer, which was good news for them, since at that point it was 1910 and aspirin made up 25% of Bayer's American sales. And then World War I started. The UK stopped buying German goods, but doctors still wanted to prescribe aspirin. So their Board of Trade eliminated Bayer's trademark in the UK, which allowed English drug makers to manufacture and market aspirin. Bayer's US patent on acetylsalicylic acid expired in 1917, at which point competitors started manufacturing their own. Then after the war ended, the US seized certain German intellectual property under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and among them was Bayer's other IP, including the trademark on the name aspirin. The office sold the aspirin name and Bayer logo to an American patent medicine company called Sterling Drug for $3.5 million. This is also when the name aspirin starts to replace acetylsalicylic acid as the generic name. Okay, so World War I is over, aspirin's patent has expired, and every pharmaceutical company rolls out their own versions. This is why you can find these little aspirin tins all over eBay. They were so common, they were less than a dime a dozen. Throughout the 1920s, aspirin continued to grow in popularity around the world. And while aspirin dominated for decades, new drugs came along and ate into their pain relief market. The full story deserves its own video, but the first of these competitors was paracetamol, or acetaminophen, which came out in the early 50s. Then in the late 50s, a scientist named Stuart Adams started work on another new one. He worked for Boots Pure Drug Company in the UK and got put in charge of finding a drug for rheumatoid arthritis that didn't use steroids. So Adams thought, what about aspirin? It's a good anti-inflammatory, and I bet we could find a way to make something that doesn't upset stomachs. Adams and his team spent the next 10 years brute force screening hundreds of compounds, one after another. Propionic acid seemed like a potent option, but it wasn't that effective in clinical trials. But they could tell they were on the right track. So they created a propionic acid derivative named 2p-isobutylphenyl propionic acid, a compound that would become known as ibuprofen. In 1969, a US-based company called Upjohn licensed it from Boots and eventually sold it under the trade name Motrin. A few years later, a different company released a lower dose of ibuprofen available over the counter that they sold as Advil. Aspirin and ibuprofen were some of the first in a new category of drugs called NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And of course, more drugs came into the space, like naproxen, which you might know as Aleve, which was approved in the US in 1976, and diclofenac, which you might know as Voltaren in 1988. But all this time, doctors were starting to notice some peculiarities with aspirin users. They tended to bleed a lot. In 1945, an American doctor studied a bunch of tonsillectomy patients and noticed that the ones who took aspirin afterwards for pain tended to bleed more a few days after surgery. By 1948, a British doctor named Paul Gibson wondered if it might be because aspirin had some kind of anticoagulant effect. Like maybe aspirin kept blood cells from clumping together. So the next year, he published some case reports in The Lancet describing how aspirin could relieve chest pain. These weren't rigorous studies, they're more like well-documented anecdotes. But it got more doctors interested in the idea of using aspirin for cardiovascular disease. See, by the middle of the century, some doctors were using anticoagulants like dicumarol to treat heart attacks, but it was still controversial. The hypothesis was that if someone already has atherosclerosis, then aspirin would keep blood clots from lodging into those narrowed arteries. Either way, as of 1950, aspirin had settled into its market position as the best-selling painkiller. There was just one thing: nobody knew how it worked. At that point, scientists were learning that there were these chemicals called kinins that were involved in the inflammatory response. And a scientist named Henry Collier was especially interested in a type of kinin called bradykinin, a chemical that leads to relaxed blood vessels and increased pain. But it can also lead to bronchoconstriction, or a tightening of the airway, particularly in people with asthma. Collier ran some experiments where he'd induce bronchoconstriction in asthmatic guinea pigs by giving them bradykinin, but he noticed that if he gave them aspirin before bradykinin, their airways stayed open. So at first, he thought that aspirin was an antagonist of bradykinin, that it blocked bradykinin from plugging into its intended receptors. And that would explain the analgesic properties, but it still didn't explain how it could reduce inflammation or lower fevers. So he recruited a collaborator named Priscilla Piper, who teamed up with another researcher named John Vane, who developed a potentially useful test. Here's how it worked. They took guinea pig lungs and put them at one end of an assay, then put little bits of tissue at the other end of an assay. This could be stuff like chicken rectums or the stomach lining from a rat. Then, they'd induce shock in the lungs, which would secrete an unidentified batch of chemicals through the medium, and they would mingle with the tissues on the other side. So one day, Vane and Piper ran their assay with an aorta from a rabbit on the other end, and they got it to twitch. So they called this mystery substance rabbit aorta contracting substance. Kind of a placeholder name. But they were able to prevent the rabbit aorta from twitching if they injected aspirin into the guinea pig lungs before inducing shock. Whatever this aorta contracting substance was, it wasn't an antagonist. Aspirin kept the lungs from secreting something. In 1969, Piper and Vane published their results in Nature. 2 years later, Vane and Piper identified the mystery contracting substance as a prostaglandin. And they confirmed that aspirin wasn't a prostaglandin antagonist. Aspirin actually inhibited the cell's ability to synthesize new prostaglandin. That was followed up in 1975 by a Swedish researcher named Bent Samuelsson, who showed that aspirin also inhibited a substance called thromboxane A2. Its main job is stimulating platelets in the blood to clot together. The thrombo in thromboxane refers to clotting. But it can also cause blood vessels to constrict, which is probably why Vane and Piper's rabbit aorta was twitching. The next year, a research team at the University of Michigan found the missing piece of the puzzle. They identified an enzyme that's necessary to form prostaglandins, and that's what aspirin actually affects. It's called cyclooxygenase enzyme, or COX for short. It's okay to giggle. Here's how we understand how it works these days. When you get hurt, your body will make prostaglandin and kick off an inflammatory response. This is where things like redness, pain, and swelling come from. When your body gives the signal to make prostaglandins, your cell membranes release this substance called arachidonic acid. Then a few enzymes come along and bind to arachidonic acid to make prostaglandin precursors, then other prostaglandins. We care about two of these enzymes, COX-1 and COX-2. These are what aspirin inhibits. You can think of COX-1 as your daily driver enzymes. It does a bunch of things, including catalyze the creation of prostaglandins involved in protecting our stomach linings. This is where the tummy side effects come from. Less COX-1 activity means less protection against stomach acid. It's also the one involved in thromboxane A2 synthesis in platelets, that component of blood that makes it clot together. That's why all those tonsillectomy patients bled so much. COX-2, on the other hand, is more often released during the inflammatory response. But it's not a total binary, like both can be released during inflammation. Acetylsalicylic acid binds to each of the COX enzymes in the spot where they would bind to arachidonic acid. So now the enzymes can't turn it into prostaglandin or thromboxane A2 anymore. Now, importantly, aspirin is non-selective, meaning it binds to both COX enzymes instead of just one. But it is more potent at inhibiting COX-1 than COX-2. It's also irreversible, meaning that once aspirin is bound to an enzyme, it doesn't let go. Ibuprofen and most other NSAIDs work similarly. They inhibit both COX enzymes. So back to the story. All that pharmacological research was happening before scientists had identified both COX enzymes. They finally identified COX-2 around 1990, at which point drug developers wondered if they might be able to design a drug that would only inhibit COX-2. After all, if COX-1 inhibition was causing most of the side effects, then selectively targeting COX-2 would target inflammation and prevent the tummy stuff, and that would be especially helpful for chronic inflammatory diseases. Luckily, since so many companies had been researching NSAIDs for decades, there were a bunch of potential drugs to pick from. Like by that point, DuPont had already found an anti-inflammatory compound which they'd codenamed DUP697. This one didn't burn holes in people's stomachs, which was a good indicator that it wasn't a typical NSAID. So when the COX-2 enzyme was discovered, they thought, oh, this thing might be a selective COX-2 inhibitor. The first to come out was celecoxib, which you might know as Celebrex. It hit the American market in December of 1988 and was followed by rofecoxib, which came out just a few months after. You might know this one as Vioxx. And as you can probably tell, coxib indicates that it's a COX-2 inhibitor. These new COX-2 inhibitors sold really well at first. Rofecoxib, celecoxib, and Pfizer's valdecoxib all hit blockbuster status. But within a few years, reports and lawsuits started piling up claiming that Vioxx led to heart attacks. And in September of 2004, Merck took rofecoxib off the market, making it the biggest pharmaceutical withdrawal to date. Pfizer followed and took valdecoxib, trade name Bextra, off the market in 2005. Honestly, this is one of those stories that could be its own video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see it. As far as aspirin went, all of that mechanism of action research from the 70s finally taught us how it worked, but there was still one big question. Does this drug actually reduce the risk of heart attacks? Yeah, it inhibits thromboxane A2, but that doesn't automatically mean it'll be useful clinically. In 1974, a research group led by Peter Elwood published a paper trying to answer that question in the British Medical Journal. They had recruited over 1,200 men under age 65 who had all been discharged from the hospital with their first myocardial infarction, or heart attack. Then they were randomized to get either a single dose of 300 milligrams of aspirin a day or a placebo a day. The researchers followed up 1 week, then 1 month, then every 3 months afterwards, noting whether the participants had had another heart attack or if they died. And while there wasn't a statistically significant difference in second heart attacks, there was a reduction in total mortality after a year of follow-up, and a bigger difference after 2 years of follow-up in the aspirin group. In that same issue of the British Medical Journal, it's actually literally the next article, a research group from Boston published their own aspirin study. Starting in 1966, they took simple surveys of patients admitted to hospitals and asked them what kind of drugs they regularly took. Then they tried to find correlations between drugs and whatever they were diagnosed with. The Boston group was more confident in their conclusion. They thought that they had evidence to say that aspirin lowered your risk of heart attacks. But none of these studies were that powerful by themselves. That's where meta-analyses come in. These are studies that look at similar studies so that they can pull out trends from the aggregated data. And in 1980, a scientist named Richard Peto, who I actually talked about in the smoking video, published a meta-analysis of studies that measured aspirin's effects on heart attacks. He gathered 6 trials with a combined total of over 10,000 participants who had already had heart attacks and had been randomized to get either placebo or aspirin. From the aggregated data, Peto concluded that taking aspirin reduced the chances of a second heart attack by 21% and lowered the risk of stroke. And a few years later, a study from the VA showed that aspirin might be able to prevent first heart attacks in people with unstable angina, or chest pain coming from the heart muscle not getting enough oxygen, usually from blocked vessels around the heart. Evidence was mounting that aspirin could actually lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. But it took a few years and multiple hearings, one of which actually got pretty heated, to convince the FDA to allow aspirin makers to put new claims on their labels. But finally, in 1985, the FDA approved aspirin as part of the treatment for acute heart attacks and to help prevent repeat heart attacks. And in 1988, the second international study on infarct survival, unfortunately abbreviated to ISIS-2, provided even more evidence. They followed people who experienced symptoms of a heart attack and then were randomized to either get 162 milligrams of aspirin or a placebo for 30 days. At 5 weeks, the aspirin group had a reduced risk of death from heart attacks and stroke and a reduced risk of non-deadly heart attacks and stroke. And it seemed to be a safe treatment too. Like, while the aspirin group saw a small increase in minor bleeding, there wasn't increased risk of anything life-threatening. So in 1997, the American Heart Association came out with a position statement saying that aspirin was a safe and effective way to treat acute myocardial infarction. But more data has come out since then, which led the AHA to refine their position statement. The 2019 recommendations are a bit more nuanced. They still advise taking aspirin to prevent secondary heart attack, but acknowledge that it's not as universal of a recommendation for primary prevention, or preventing cardiovascular disease in otherwise healthy people. Like, there were risks and rewards, and it depends on the person. This also seems like a good point to remind you that this is not medical advice, and please don't make medical decisions based on what a dude on the internet says about history. So coming back to the premise of the video and this series more broadly, why did NSAIDs become the most commonly used medicines in the world? The first reason is that aspirin has been addressing the biggest markets for a long time. Like, when it came out in 1900, we didn't have antibiotics and we only had a few vaccines, so fevers from infectious disease were extremely common. But even when we got antibiotics, aspirin was still the most accessible medicine for aches and pains. Then when acetaminophen and ibuprofen came along, it wasn't long until aspirin was being investigated for cardiovascular disease, which by the end of the 20th century was only becoming more common. So reason number one, blockbusters are made from enormous markets. Number two, branding. Bayer pushed its brand hard when they launched aspirin. And this was partly because of the lessons learned during the phenacetin saga, but also because it was worth it. Like, it was so worth it that in 1994, Bayer bought its North American branch back for $1 billion. Again, aspirin was a cheap generic at that point. Bayer was spending $1 billion for its name. Finally, aspirin offered more value than its competitors. Aspirin wasn't the first antipyretic, but it was much more comfortable on the stomach than regular old salicylic acid. Plus, the manufacturing process made it cheaper than the stuff made from willow trees, which customers always appreciate. Now, of course, not every drug with a massive customer base gets cheaper from competition. The next video in the series is about a drug taken by tens of millions of Americans every day, but dominated by one company. Next up, the story of Eli Lilly's insulin.